Last year, I made a mistake. I made lots of mistakes last year, but we'll just focus on this one relevant for today. It all started with a routine trip to Tesco to pick up a few things. Being as I didn't have much to buy, I thought I'd go to the do-it-yourself checkout and pay there. The first mistake, for there were actually two in this story, was putting my items through a checkout that was already being used by somebody else. I didn't know it was, for I couldn't see any items nor anyone buying them. So I started scanning my products, only to be confronted by a very angry woman who had gone off to get something and come back to find I was putting items on her bill. I apologized and used the next checkout along, while she called someone over to deal with my error. We then carried on scanning our respective items, but she was looking at me daggers, clearly very unhappy with how I'd inconvenienced her. I could feel her penetrating glare to the point I was getting just a little bit irritated. So I went over to her, this was mistake number 2, and said, "We all make mistakes, you know, even you," which poured fuel on her fire that really didn't need any. I then saw her again with an assistant and wondered if I should have said that. So I thought I ought to go over and apologize. So I walked across and said, "Sorry, I didn't really mean it." He then said, "Go away. Go away, or I shall call security." He then started pouring out a life story, which I was really not wanting to be part of. By this point, I was getting a little bit anxious, so I left her to it and paid for my shopping. I then realized I'd already paid for it once already, so I had to go over to customer services and explain what had happened. I said I'd paid for my shopping twice because I got a bit worked up as someone was rude to me, playing the victim. She then thought it was her colleague who was rude and was about to escalate this when I said no, it was a customer. The book of Proverbs says a gentle answer turns away wrath. And that's what I could have done with when confronted with the anger of a person who clearly had a lot going on in her life. The Ten Commandments say, "You shall not murder." But Jesus said, anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Over the last few months in the Middle East, we have seen the devastating consequences for both sides of unresolved anger. And whilst our own lives aren't dealing with such horrific extremes, we all know what can happen if anger is left to fester and grow. Whether it be about military conflict or industrial disputes, demonstrations about the issues that cause feelings to run high have been a familiar sight on our streets for hundreds of years. Public anger is nothing new. In 1749, a performer claimed he could fit his body into a wine bottle. He was due to appear at the Haymarket Theatre in London to demonstrate this somewhat bizarre feat, but when he didn't show up, the disappointed crowds had a riot. What we need, as can be seen from today's passage, is a different kind of demonstration, with a chant like this. A chant that says, to deal with anger, what do we need? To deal with anger, when should we do so? Now. This is the gist of Jesus' words, and I'd like to demonstrate that myself with the following 3 points. We need a different standard. We need a dispute sorted. And we need a difference settled. But before we take the first of those, a little context. Last week, Matt took us through Jesus' words about the law, that he had not come to overturn it, but to fulfill it. His words about anger are the first of 6 sections running from verse 21 through to verse 48 of Matthew chapter 5. Once Jesus has made it clear that he's not opposing the law itself, but interpreting it, he shows how the customary practice of the law in his day was inadequate. In explaining these 6 legal texts from the Old Testament, Jesus makes the law more stringent. He's saying, and this is our first point, we need a different standard. We need a different standard. Look at Jesus' words in verse 21. You have heard that it was said to the people long ago, you shall not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment. But I tell you that anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to a brother or sister, Raca, is answerable to the court. And anyone who says, you fool, will be in danger of the fire of hell. Most, if not all of us, haven't killed anyone. But that is not enough in the standard that Jesus sets here in the Sermon on the Mount. For knowing human nature more than anyone else, Jesus is saying it's not about how much you can get away with, but what you should do away with. And anger is a red line we should not cross. But let's qualify his words with what's actually here in front of us in verse 22. Anyone who is angry with a brother or sister will be subject to judgment. In the footnote, it says angry without cause, which needs to be acknowledged but treated with caution. It's very easy to take liberties with that little clause and say, I have every right to be angry, just like Jonah was, when the plant went pear-shaped, as it were. Perhaps, staying in Jonah chapter 4, we need to hear the Lord's question, is it right for you to be angry? Because there are times in our lives when anger may be justified. After all, Jesus got angry, and he was a man who never sinned. His most famous example of him clearing the temple, though, is sometimes misunderstood. His anger here is not about people buying things on the Sabbath, but on his father's house being turned into a marketplace where people were being ripped off. As we see on numerous occasions in the Old Testament, injustice is something that offends the heart of God. For everyone is made in his image and deserves better than they often get. But there's a fine line here, and the Lord's question to Jonah, is it right for you to be angry, needs to be one we bring to mind every time the temptation is there to flare up at someone. Let's go through a day in our lives. You're late getting out of bed. Is it right for you to be angry? The grill hasn't been cleaned from the night before. Is it right for you to be angry? Someone cuts you up on the way to the shops. Is it right for you to be angry? Someone annoys you at the shops. Is it right for you to be angry? Your Amazon parcel has fallen 5 minutes outside the delivery slot. Is it right for you to be angry? If you have answered yes to any of the above, or indeed all of them, you're about my standard. But that, believe me, is not good enough. Let's turn that day inside out and think not of ourselves, but of others. Some don't have a bed to get out of. Is it right for you to be angry about that? They won't have breakfast this morning. Is it right for you to be angry? They can't afford a car to get to the shops. They can't afford anything when they get there. And the Amazon delivery driver can't support his family and support most of the products he's dropping off. Meanwhile, 33 children around the world are born into hunger every minute, and over 8,000 under fives will die every day due to starvation and other related causes. Is it right for you to be angry about that? Of course, anger doesn't change anything, and if that's all you are, you won't help anyone. But the point I make hopefully challenges all of us, myself included, to think about what makes us angry and what we're going to do about it. Benjamin Franklin once said, anger is never without a reason, but seldom with a good one. And how right he was. Back in Matthew 5:22, Jesus uses two further examples of how anger can be demonstrated in what we say to others. Raka was a term of contempt of its time and place. You fool speaks for itself in any historical or geographical context. Neither is something we want to be on the receiving end of, so we should think before we speak to others. How many times, and I speak to myself first, have we said something in anger only to regret it later? All of us need to pray what I call the preacher's prayer, whether we deliver sermons or not. From Psalm 141, verse 3. Set a guard over my mouth, Lord. Keep watch over the door of my lips. I'm showing my age here, not for the first time, but what came to mind here was a picture of the old fire guard, which did what it said on the tin, guarding you from the real fires that blazed in our homes. The Apostle James said in his epistle, "Consider what a great forest is set on fire by a small spark." The tongue also is a fire, a world of evil among the parts of the body. It corrupts the whole body, sets the whole course of one's life on fire, and is itself set on fire by hell. We have seen in recent times the damage caused by forest fires across the world, from Greece to Australia to the States. It's an image which needs no explanation when it comes to the devastating impact of angry words. Let's do something which we need to do when tempted to use them, and that's move on with our second point. We need a dispute sorted. Look at verses 23 and 24. Therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First, go and be reconciled to them. Then, come and offer your gift. Once again, Jesus' words need to be put in a historical context. His Galilean hearers on this mountainside wouldn't have been able to just nip back to their homes from the temple altar in Jerusalem. This would have been a round trip of 150 miles. So it would end up being a sacrifice of a different sort. In short, it would have been a conscious decision you wouldn't have taken lightly, but it would have been necessary, for Jesus, whilst fulfilling the law, was advocating relationship over religion, and so should we. So what does this mean for us? Coming to God's house to meet with his people is, whilst an encouragement, a challenge, and that it should provoke our hearts to consider where we're at with our brothers and sisters. This is particularly true with regard to the communion service. If we're not in a right relationship with our sibling in Christ, it taints the offering, as it were, that we come to bring. Jesus quoted the Old Testament when he said, "I desire mercy, not sacrifice." And if we're not showing any mercy to others, this will not go unnoticed by the Lord when we bring our sacrifice of praise. We need a dispute sorted. Notice, by the way, that Jesus says if your brother or sister has something against you, not the other way round. There is to be reconciliation before religion. The way the Lord puts this anticipates such situations between ourselves being a part of life, and we all know that that's all too true. So the challenge for us as we come to worship each week is to think what we need to do before we get here. None of this is easy. Unresolved anger, if not dealt with, can grow into something that manifests itself in all sorts of ways. We need to keep that in check and take it to the Lord in prayer. Today, being the 25th, makes it 5 months to my birthday and 10 months to Christmas. Just putting it out there. I'm reminded of the words of the carol, God Rest Ye Merry Gentlemen, which has as its closing lines, "This holy tide of Christmas, all anger should efface." Given it's the 25th of February, maybe we should put it like this. When we consider Jesus' words, our anger should erase. Or to quote another carol, God and sinners reconciled. Maybe the unseasonal version should read us and sinners reconciled. For we're all sinners in need of reconciliation with each other. He or she started it, should be no excuse. We need to stop it and nip in the bud the seeds of anger with all that would grow into. And so we've considered two of our needs, a different standard and a dispute sorted. Thirdly and finally, we need a difference settled, which brings us to verses 25 and 26, where Jesus said, "Settle matters quickly with your adversary, who is taking you to court. Do it while you are still together on the way, or your adversary may hand you over to the judge, and the judge may hand you over to the officer, and you may be thrown into prison. Truly I tell you, you will not get out until you have paid the last penny." Mention of court reminds me of something I read recently, which demonstrates that anger can have far-reaching consequences, not least for ourselves. The 18th century physician John Hunter, who was a pioneer in the field of surgery and served as a surgeon to George III, suffered from angina. Discovering that his attacks were often brought on by anger, Hunter lamented, "My life is at the mercy of any scoundrel who chooses to put me in a passion." These words proved prophetic, for at a meeting of the board of St. George's Hospital in London, Hunter got into a heated argument with other board members, walked out, and dropped dead in the next room. Whilst this is extreme, Jesus' words in verses 25 and 26 almost plead with us to sort things out before they have more serious consequences. Imprisonment was generally a temporary holding place until punishment. Here, however, a longer penalty is envisaged. The last penny refers to the second smallest Roman coin, only a few minutes' wages for even a day labourer. As one commentary put it, when we damage our relationships with others, we damage our relationship before God. And so I ask you, what differences do you have with those around you? And what are you doing to resolve them? For although these last two verses in our short passage today seem to look at a particular situation, there's a principle here which can be summed up in the first three words of verse 25. Settle matters quickly. To come back to our demonstration chant, what does God want? Unity. When does he want it? Now. This was the primary prayer of the Lord Jesus in John 17, when in praying for his disciples and all who would follow them, i.e. you and me, that we would be as one, and that our unity would lead to the world knowing Jesus for themselves. This is what we should want too, the salvation of people, as opposed to the scoring of points. You probably come across that prayer that says, "Dear Lord, so far I've done all right. I haven't gossiped, haven't lost my temper, haven't been greedy, grumpy, nasty, selfish, or overindulgent. I'm really glad about that. But in a few minutes, Lord, I'm going to get out of bed. And from then on, I'm going to need a lot more help." You see, sermon application is one thing when you're sitting listening to it. But in a few minutes, you'll be getting off your chair and interacting with those around you. You'll then go home, maybe by car, and deal with whatever was unresolved from before you came. And from then on, all of us are going to need a lot more help. But help is at hand from the God who loves us. A few weeks ago, I was indulging in one of my favourite activities, browsing in a bookshop, when I came across this book, How to Keep Your Cool, An Ancient Guide to Anger Management, by Seneca, with figure 1 there on the front cover, a Roman losing his cool. Before you all rush out to buy for me, and I was tempted, but I've got a whole library of unfinished books, I'd like to recommend the ancient guide to anger management, the Bible. For in this book are a whole range of pithy quotes, teaching and stories which demonstrate the need to keep our cool and the consequences when we don't. And as you read, pray for the Lord's help, that when you get out of here into the challenge of everyday life, your mistakes will be so last year, and that by God's grace, He'll guide you for the rest of this one and beyond. Amen.